Admiral Zethric stood on the command bridge of the Sovereign Dominion, his scaled hands clasped behind his back as he gazed through the vast transparisteel viewport. Before him stretched the endless expanse of the Andromeda Galaxy, dotted with the lights of 1,000 worlds under his command. His amber eyes, evolved from millions of years of nocturnal hunting, tracked the movement of his fleet with practiced ease. The Corvani Empire had ruled these stars for over 3 millennia. Their military might was legendary, their tactical prowess unmatched. Zethric himself had commanded fleets across 17 different galaxies, crushing rebellions and expanding their territory with methodical precision. His reputation preceded him wherever the Empire's ships traveled. The Iron Admiral, they called him. The one who never lost a battle. "Status report," Zethric commanded, his voice carrying the authority of countless victories. Commander Valux, his second-in-command, approached with a data tablet clutched in his webbed fingers. "Sir, our long-range scouts have completed their survey of the target galaxy, the one the locals call the Milky Way." Zethric turned from the viewport, his attention now focused entirely on the briefing. This was to be another routine conquest, another galaxy to add to the Empire's vast collection. The pattern was always the same: identify the dominant species, analyze their technology and military capabilities, then execute a swift and decisive campaign to bring them under Corvani rule. "What did the scouts find?" Zethric asked, though he already suspected the answer would be disappointingly familiar. Valux activated the holographic display, and a 3-dimensional map of the Milky Way appeared before them. Various star systems pulsed with different colors, indicating levels of technological development and military strength. "The galaxy appears to be in a state of relative peace, sir. Multiple species have achieved faster than light travel, but their military technologies are primitive. Most still rely on kinetic weapons and basic energy shields. There are several major powers: the Zenthran Collective, the Altarian Republic, the Vegan Trade Union, but none pose any significant threat to our forces." Zethric nodded, unsurprised. It was the same story in every galaxy they encountered. Advanced civilizations that had grown complacent in peacetime, their military edge dulled by prosperity and diplomatic solutions. They would offer token resistance, perhaps form some sort of alliance, but ultimately fall before the Corvani war machine like wheat before a harvester. "What about this species here?" Zethric pointed to a relatively small cluster of star systems near the galaxy's outer rim. The systems pulsed with a curious yellow light that he hadn't seen in the briefing materials. Valux consulted his tablet, a slight frown crossing his reptilian features. "Ah, yes. The humans. They're unusual, sir. In what way?" "Well, they've only achieved interstellar flight within the last few centuries. Their technology is significantly behind the other major powers. Their ships are crude. Their weapons are primitive kinetic projectiles and simple directed energy beams. By all measures, they should be irrelevant to our conquest plans." Zethric waited for the qualifier he could hear in his officer's voice. But they've been involved in more military conflicts than all the other species combined. Their entire history is one continuous cycle of warfare. They fight each other. They fight alien species. They even fight their own artificial intelligences. And they win. More often than they should, given their technological disadvantages. The Admiral studied the display more carefully. The human territories were indeed small compared to the vast empires of their galactic neighbors, but they were also remarkably well defended. The scout data showed an unusual concentration of military installations and patrol fleets for such a technologically inferior species. "Explain their tactical doctrines," Zethric ordered. Valux brought up a series of battle recordings that their scouts had intercepted. "This is where it gets interesting, sir. Most species in this galaxy follow predictable patterns: long-range engagements, formal battle lines, careful preservation of resources. The humans don't." The holographic display showed a human fleet engaging a much larger force of insectoid ships. Zethric watched with growing interest as the human vessels broke formation and scattered, using seemingly suicidal maneuvers to get close to their enemies. Instead of the measured exchange of fire he expected, the humans rammed their ships into enemy vessels, detonated their own reactors as weapons, and used tactics that bordered on the insane. "They have a saying," Valux continued, reading from his notes, "the best defense is a good offense. They don't seem to understand the concept of acceptable losses. When most species would retreat to preserve their forces, humans escalate. Zethryx had conquered 17 galaxies, but he had to admit this was unusual. Most species valued self-preservation above victory. It was rational, logical, predictable. These humans seemed to operate on entirely different principles. "Show me more recent engagements," he commanded. The display shifted to a battle between human forces and the Zenthran Collective, one of the more powerful civilizations in the Milky Way. The humans were outnumbered 3-1, their ships smaller and less advanced. Zethryx expected to see a fighting retreat, perhaps some clever defensive maneuvering. Instead, the humans charged straight into the center of the Zenthran formation, their ships weaving between enemy fire with reckless precision. When their weapons couldn't penetrate enemy shields, they used their ships as kinetic weapons. When their ships were damaged beyond repair, their crews continued fighting with handheld weapons after boarding enemy vessels. The battle ended with a human victory, but at a cost that would have been considered catastrophic by any other species. "Fascinating," Zethryx murmured. In all his years of conquest, he had never encountered a species quite like this. They fought like cornered predators, with no regard for their own survival when victory was on the line. It was tactically unsound, strategically questionable, and completely unpredictable. "Shall I classify them as a minimal threat, sir?" Valak asked. "Their technology is inferior, their numbers are limited, and their territory is small." Zethryx continued studying the tactical data, his military mind processing the implications of what he was seeing. These humans didn't fight like any species he had encountered before. They didn't seem to follow the basic principles of warfare that had served the Corvani Empire so well across multiple galaxies. "No," he said finally. "Mark them as unknown variables. I want detailed psychological profiles of their leadership, complete analysis of their military doctrine, and tactical assessments of every engagement they've been involved in for the past century. Sir, with respect, they're just primitives with aggressive tendencies. Surely our standard conquest protocols will be sufficient." Zethryx turned his amber gaze on his subordinate, and Valak immediately fell silent. The Iron Admiral hadn't earned his reputation by underestimating enemies, no matter how inferior they appeared on paper. "Commander, in my experience, the most dangerous enemies are the ones who don't fight the way they're supposed to. Begin preparations for the invasion, but I want contingency plans for every scenario. These humans may surprise us." As Valak hurried away to execute his orders, Zethryx returned his attention to the holographic display. Something about these creatures troubled him in a way he couldn't quite define. They reminded him of something from the deep evolutionary memory of his species, the desperate fury of prey that had been backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. 3 months into the Corvani invasion of the Milky Way, Admiral Zethryx found himself staring at tactical reports that defied every principle of warfare he had learned in his centuries of military service. The holographic display in his war room showed the current state of the campaign, and the results were nothing like what his projections had predicted. The conquest should have been completed within 6 weeks. The Corvani fleet had swept through the outer systems with their usual efficiency, overwhelming the scattered defensive forces of minor species with minimal casualties. The Zenthran Collective had surrendered after losing their primary fleet in a single decisive engagement. The Altarian Republic had fallen within days once their command structure was eliminated. Even the mighty vegan trade union had capitulated rather than face total annihilation, but the humans refused to follow the script. "Report from Admiral Corinth in Sector 7, Commander Valak announced, his scaled skin bearing a slight tremor that Zethryx had never seen before. "The Third Fleet has withdrawn from the Sol system." Zethryx's amber eyes narrowed. Withdrawn? Or retreated? The distinction was important. A withdrawal was a tactical repositioning, a planned maneuver to achieve better strategic positioning. A retreat was something else entirely, something the Corvani military hadn't experienced in living memory. "The humans call it the Battle of Mars, sir." Admiral Corinth engaged what appeared to be a small defensive fleet, protecting the human homeworld. Initial scans showed primitive spacecraft, minimal shielding, kinetic weapons that shouldn't have been able to penetrate our hull plating. Valak activated the battle recordings, and Zethryx watched with growing disbelief as the engagement unfolded. The human ships were indeed primitive, crude metal constructions that looked more like industrial equipment than warships. They moved slowly compared to Corvani vessels, Their weapons fired projectiles instead of energy beams, and their defensive systems were laughably inadequate. But they fought like nothing Zethryx had ever witnessed. The human fleet didn't maintain formation. Instead, individual ships broke away to attack specific targets, often sacrificing themselves to take down larger Corvani vessels. When their primary weapons failed to penetrate enemy shields, human crews manually steered their ships into collision courses, detonating their reactors at the moment of impact. Others launched what appeared to be small fighters that attached themselves to Corvani hulls and exploded. "They're using their crews as ammunition," Zethryx said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It gets worse, sir." When Admiral Corinth's flagship was boarded, the human soldiers fought with an intensity that our psychological warfare specialists can't explain. They wouldn't surrender, wouldn't retreat, wouldn't even attempt to preserve their own lives when victory became impossible. They just kept fighting until they were all dead. The recording showed Corvani security forces advancing through the corridors of their own ship, hunting down human boarders who had somehow breached the hull. But instead of the quick, efficient operation Zethryx expected, he watched his elite soldiers struggle against humans armed with primitive kinetic weapons and explosive devices. The humans used tactics that bordered on insanity, hiding in ventilation shafts, rigging improvised booby traps, fighting to the death in battles they couldn't possibly win. "Casualty report?" Zethryx asked, though he dreaded the answer. 37 ships lost, sir. Over 40,000 casualties. Against a force 1/10 our size using technology we outclassed by several centuries. Zethryx closed his eyes, feeling something he hadn't experienced in his long military career. Uncertainty. The numbers didn't make sense. By every logical calculation, the human fleet should have been annihilated within minutes. Instead, they had inflicted casualties that would have been considered heavy even in a battle against an equally matched opponent. What happened to Admiral Corinth? "He's alive, sir, but changed. The medical staff reports severe psychological trauma. He keeps talking about human eyes, about how they looked at him when they were dying. He's requested reassignment to a rear logistics position." Zethryx had known Corinth for 2 centuries. The Admiral was a veteran of 43 major engagements, a warrior who had personally led boarding actions against some of the most dangerous species in known space. For him to request a transfer after encountering humans was unprecedented. "Show me the intelligence reports on human psychology," Zethryx commanded. Valix activated a new display, showing detailed analysis compiled by the Empire's Xenopsychology Department. The data painted a picture of a species unlike any other they had encountered. Humans appear to possess what they call persistence hunting, instincts carried over from their evolutionary development. When threatened, they don't display typical fight-or-flight responses. Instead, they enter a state they call berserker rage, where pain, tolerance increases dramatically and self-preservation instincts are suppressed in favor of eliminating the threat. The display showed brain scans of human prisoners, taken during various skirmishes. Their neural activity during combat was utterly alien. Regions associated with fear and self-preservation showed minimal activity, while areas linked to aggression and determination blazed with energy. "They have a cultural concept called going down swinging," Valix continued. "Even when defeat is inevitable, humans consider it honorable to inflict maximum damage on their enemies before dying. They've weaponized their own mortality." Zethryx studied the psychological profiles with growing unease. The humans didn't just fight differently, they thought differently. Where most species saw war as a tool to achieve political or economic objectives, humans seemed to view it as something approaching religious experience. They had dozens of sayings that reflected this mindset. "Death before dishonor. Give me liberty or give me death. They shall not pass." "What about their leadership?" Zethryx asked. "Surely they must see the futility of resistance against our superior forces." "That's the most disturbing part, sir. Human leadership appears to be unified in their determination to fight to the last person. They've activated something called Total War Protocol. Every human colony, every space station, every ship is being converted into a military asset. They're not just refusing to surrender. They're escalating." The tactical display updated to show the current disposition of human forces throughout their territory. What Zethryx saw made his blood run cold. The humans hadn't concentrated their forces for a few decisive battles as any rational species would do. Instead, They had dispersed their military assets across hundreds of worlds, preparing for what appeared to be a prolonged guerrilla campaign. They're preparing to fight us for every planet, every moon, every asteroid in their space, Valak said quietly. Our analysts estimate that even with our technological superiority, a complete conquest of human territory could take decades and cost us millions of casualties. Zethrix had conquered 17 galaxies, but he had never faced an enemy like this. Most species, when confronted with overwhelming force, sought negotiated surrenders or strategic retreats. They fought to preserve their civilization, their culture, their lives. The humans seemed to fight simply to fight, as if the act of resistance itself was more important than survival. Send a communication to the human leadership, Zethrix ordered. Offer them terms: autonomy within the Empire, preservation of their culture, minimal tribute requirements. Make it clear that continued resistance will only result in unnecessary casualties. Sir, we've already made similar offers through diplomatic channels. The human response was brief. What did they say? Valak consulted his tablet, his expression uncomfortable. The exact words were, "Come and take it." Zethrix stared at the tactical display for a long moment, watching as more red indicators appeared. Human military buildups, defensive preparations, fleet movements that suggested coordinated resistance across their entire territory. For the first time in his long career, he found himself facing an enemy that he couldn't predict, couldn't intimidate, and couldn't understand. The humans were going to make them pay for every star system, every planet, every victory. They were going to turn what should have been a simple conquest into something approaching a galactic war, and they were going to do it with primitive weapons, obsolete ships, and a determination that defied every principle of rational warfare. Prepare contingency plans for extended siege warfare, Zethrix ordered finally, and request reinforcements from High Command. We're going to need them. The siege of Proxima Centauri had lasted 8 months, and Admiral Zethrix was beginning to understand why no civilization in recorded history had ever successfully conquered humans on a large scale. The system should have fallen within weeks. It was a single star with 2 habitable planets and a handful of orbital installations. By every military doctrine the Corvani Empire had developed over millennia of conquest, overwhelming force applied at key strategic points should have resulted in swift capitulation. Instead, Zethrix found himself commanding the largest military operation in Corvani history. With over 200 vessels besieging a system defended by perhaps 30 human ships and a civilian population that refused to acknowledge the concept of defeat. Status report from the 4th Assault Group, Commander Valak announced, his voice carrying the weariness that had settled over the entire fleet. They've successfully captured the orbital mining platform, but? Zethrix prompted, though he already knew what was coming. The humans rigged it to explode before evacuating. The detonation took out 3 of our vessels and damaged 5 more. Preliminary estimates suggest they destroyed over 1 billion credits worth of infrastructure, rather than let us capture it intact. Zethrix rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of command pressing down on him like never before. The humans had turned the entire Proxima system into what they called a fortress world. Every asteroid had been mined with explosives, every space station had been converted into a weapons platform, and every civilian facility had been rigged for demolition. They weren't just fighting to defend their territory, they were fighting to deny him any benefit from conquering it. What about the surface assault on Proxima B? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. Valak activated the holographic display showing a 3-dimensional map of the planet's surface. Red markers indicated Corvani landing zones, while pulsing orange dots showed areas of active resistance. There were far too many orange dots. General Korthak reports that his forces have secured primary landing sites and established beachheads around the major population centers. However, the humans have implemented what they call scorched earth tactics. They're destroying agricultural facilities, industrial infrastructure, transportation networks, anything that might be useful to an occupying force. The display zoomed in on specific regions, showing the extent of the destruction. Vast agricultural complexes had been burned to the ground. Manufacturing facilities had been demolished with carefully placed charges. Even civilian infrastructure like hospitals and schools had been stripped of useful equipment before being abandoned. It's not just military resistance, Valak continued. The entire civilian population has been mobilized. Children are being used as scouts and message runners. Elderly civilians are constructing improvised explosive devices. Everyone from farmers to teachers has been armed and organized into resistance cells. Zethric studied the reports with growing dismay. In every other conquest he had overseen, civilian populations had either fled or surrendered once their military forces were defeated. The humans seemed incapable of comprehending the concept of submission. They fought as if every individual was a soldier, as if every settlement was a fortress, as if surrender was literally incomprehensible to them. Casualty projections? He asked quietly. At current rates, we'll need at least 2 years to fully pacify Proxima B, assuming we commit another 50,000 troops and accept casualty rates of 30%. And that's just one planet and one system. Zethric closed his eyes, performing rapid calculations in his head. If every human world required similar resources to conquer, the complete subjugation of human space would require the entire Corvani military and take decades to complete. The economic cost alone would bankrupt several provinces. Sir, Valak said hesitantly, there's something else. Intelligence has intercepted human communications that suggest they're implementing something called the Masada Protocol. Explain. Rather than allow their worlds to be conquered, the humans are prepared to render them uninhabitable. They've placed nuclear devices at key infrastructure points on every major world. If defeat becomes inevitable, they'll detonate them simultaneously. The implications hit Zethric like a physical blow. They're threatening to destroy their own civilization rather than submit. It appears so, sir. Our xenopsychology experts believe they're completely serious. The humans have historical precedents for this kind of behavior, multiple instances where their own people chose death over surrender. Zethric turned to stare out at the human fleet holding position near Proxima's inner planets. They were pathetically small compared to his massive armada, their ships crude and their weapons primitive. But they had fought his forces to a standstill for 8 months, inflicting casualties that would have been considered catastrophic in any normal campaign. Bring up the tactical analysis of their combat performance, he ordered. The display shifted to show detailed breakdowns of human military effectiveness. The numbers were sobering. Human forces consistently outperformed their technological limitations by factors that seemed impossible. They used tactics that violated every principle of rational warfare: suicide attacks, hopeless charges, last-stand defenses that somehow succeeded against overwhelming odds. Look at this engagement. Zethric pointed to a specific battle record. A single human destroyer held off an entire squadron of our heavy cruisers for 6 hours. They should have been destroyed in the first few minutes. According to the combat recordings, the human crew rigged their reactor for overload and used their ship as a kinetic weapon. The explosion damaged or destroyed half our squadron. And this one, a human ground force unit, held a strategic position against forces 10 times their size. They fought until their ammunition was exhausted, then used improvised weapons. When those ran out, they fought with their bare hands. Not one of them surrendered even when offered quarter. Zethric studied report after report, each one telling the same impossible story. Humans didn't just fight harder than they should be able to. They fought as if death was preferable to defeat. They turned every engagement into a last stand, every battle into a monument to their refusal to submit. How are they maintaining morale? He asked. Their casualties must be enormous. That's the most disturbing part, sir. Human casualties seem to increase their determination rather than weakening it. They have a concept called martyrdom. Dying in battle against overwhelming odds is considered the highest honor their culture can bestow. Every death makes the survivors fight harder. This was beyond Zethric's comprehension. In every other species he had encountered, casualties weakened resolve and eventually led to surrender when losses became unsustainable. The humans seemed to operate on completely inverted psychology. The more they lost, the more determined they became. Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the Human Defense Coordinator, Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force. Put it through. The holographic display shifted to show a human female in military uniform. She appeared middle-aged by human standards, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire. Behind her, Zethric could see the bridge of what was obviously a damaged ship. Exposed cables, scorched bulkheads, crew members working frantically at emergency repairs. Admiral Zethric, she said, her voice carrying a calm certainty that was somehow more unsettling than rage would have been. I understand you've been wondering why we continue to resist when defeat appears inevitable. The thought has crossed my mind. Zethrix replied carefully. Your position is hopeless. Your technology is inferior. Your forces are outnumbered, and your government has no allies capable of providing meaningful assistance. Why prolong the inevitable? Admiral Chen smiled, and for a moment Zethrix glimpsed something in her expression that chilled him to his core. It wasn't desperation or fear or even anger. It was anticipation. Because you don't understand what you're fighting, she said simply. You see a small, primitive species with limited resources and obsolete weapons. We see Tuesday. I don't understand. For 5,000 years, we've been at war with something. Sometimes it was each other. Sometimes it was our environment. Sometimes it was diseases or famines or natural disasters. We fought wars that lasted decades. Conflicts that consumed entire continents, enemies that seemed absolutely unstoppable. And we've always won eventually because we have one advantage you don't, which is, we're not afraid to lose everything. You fight to conquer, to expand your empire, to increase your power. We fight because fighting is what we do. It's what we are. And we're very, very good at it. The transmission ended, leaving Zethrix staring at the empty holographic space where the human admiral had been. For the first time in his long military career, he found himself questioning not just his tactics or strategy, but the entire foundation of Corvani military doctrine. He had come to the Milky Way expecting another routine conquest. Instead, he had found something that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare, about civilization, about the very nature of intelligent life. The humans weren't just fighting him. They were teaching him that there were forms of warfare he had never imagined, strategies based on principles his species couldn't comprehend. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a captured human soldier named Marcus Rodriguez, a sergeant in what the humans called their special forces. Unlike other human prisoners who either remained silent or taunted their captors, Rodriguez seemed willing to talk. Zethrix decided to conduct the interrogation personally, hoping to gain some insight into the human psyche that had proven so resistant to conventional military pressure. The holding cell was standard Corvani design, sterile, efficient, designed to emphasize the prisoner's helplessness and isolation. Rodriguez sat calmly in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, appearing completely at ease despite his circumstances. When Zethrix entered, the human looked up with clear, intelligent eyes that showed no trace of fear or submission. Sergeant Rodriguez, Zethrix began formally, taking a seat across from the prisoner. I am Admiral Zethrix, commander of the Corvani invasion force. I'd like to discuss the tactical situation with you. Sure thing, Admiral, Rodriguez replied with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. Though I should warn you, I'm probably not going to tell you anything useful about troop movements or strategic plans. I'm more interested in understanding your perspective on this conflict. Your forces are clearly outmatched. Your technology is primitive compared to ours. Your government has no realistic chance of victory. Why do you continue to resist? Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You know, Admiral, that's exactly the wrong question to ask. Explain. You're asking why we resist when we can't win, but from our perspective, we're not trying to win in the way you understand victory. We're trying to make the cost of conquering us so high that you'll decide it's not worth it. Zethrix frowned. But you must know that the Corvani Empire has never abandoned a conquest once it's begun. We have infinite resources, infinite patience, do you? Rodriguez asked pointedly. Because from where I'm sitting, you've been trying to take one star system for almost a year now, and you're no closer to controlling it than when you started. How many ships have you lost? How many soldiers? How much money has this campaign cost your empire? The questions hit closer to home than Zethrix cared to admit. The Proxima campaign had indeed become a massive drain on resources, far exceeding all initial projections. High Command was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the timeline and cost of the human conquest. You're fighting the wrong war, Rodriguez continued. You're trying to fight a conventional military campaign against an enemy that doesn't follow conventional military logic. It's like trying to box against someone who's playing football. The rules are completely different. Then explain your rules to me. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering how to explain something he considered self-evident. Okay, let me ask you something. What's the worst thing that could happen to your species? Extinction, obviously. Right, and what would you do to prevent that? Everything necessary. Everything. Would you sacrifice your entire civilization to prevent extinction? Would you destroy your own worlds rather than let them be conquered? Would you fight until every single member of your species was dead? Zethryx considered the question carefully. If extinction was truly inevitable, yes, I suppose we would fight to the end. Exactly. Now here's the thing about humans. We've been on the edge of extinction for most of our evolutionary history. Ice ages, supervolcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, plagues that killed 90% of our population. We survived by being willing to do whatever it took, no matter how desperate or irrational it seemed. Rodriguez stood up and began pacing the small cell, his movements precise and controlled despite his confinement. Every human child grows up hearing stories about times when our ancestors faced impossible odds and won through sheer determination. The Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off an army of hundreds of thousands. The Siege of Stalingrad, where civilians fought tanks with bottles filled with gasoline. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where people with no hope of survival chose to die fighting rather than submit to genocide. Those are historical anomalies, Zethryx protested. Desperate acts by people with no other choice. No, Admiral, that's who we are. Those weren't anomalies, they were Tuesday. We've been doing this for so long that it's not courage anymore, it's just instinct. When something threatens our survival, we don't calculate odds or consider rational surrender. We fight until we win or until there's nothing left to fight with. Zethryx found himself leaning forward, fascinated despite himself. But surely you must see the futility of your current position. Even if you make conquest costly, we will eventually succeed. Rodriguez laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Will you? Let me paint a picture for you, Admiral. You've been fighting for one star system for a year. We have over 400 colonized systems. At your current rate of progress, conquering all of human space will take you 4 centuries. Can your empire sustain a 400-year war? The mathematics were sobering. Even if the Corvani could maintain their current level of military commitment, which was already straining their resources, the cost of a complete conquest would be astronomical. But that's assuming every system requires the same level of effort as Proxima, Zethryx pointed out. Oh, they'll be worse, Rodriguez said cheerfully. Proxima was our testing ground. We've been learning from every engagement, studying your tactics, adapting our strategies. Every system you attack will be better prepared than the last. The resistance will be more organized, more effective, more costly. You're talking about a war that would consume generations. Exactly. And here's the beautiful part. We're okay with that. Human civilization has survived wars that lasted decades. Conflicts that spanned continents, campaigns that consumed entire generations. We have cultural institutions specifically designed to maintain resistance movements across centuries if necessary. We can do this literally forever. Zethryx sat back, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. But at what cost? Your entire civilization would be destroyed. Maybe, or maybe we'd win. We usually do, eventually. But even if we lost, even if you managed to kill every human in the galaxy, what would you have gained? A bunch of dead worlds, ruined infrastructure, and the knowledge that you'd spent centuries fighting a species that refused to stay conquered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The implications of Rodriguez's words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Zethryx had commanded fleets across 17 galaxies, but he had never encountered an enemy that was willing to turn victory into a Pyrrhic achievement. You're insane, Zethryx said finally. Probably, Rodriguez agreed readily, but we're consistently insane. We don't change our minds when things get difficult. We don't negotiate when we're losing, and we don't give up when victory becomes impossible. We just keep fighting until someone makes us stop. And how does one make humans stop? Rodriguez smiled, and again Zethryx saw something in his expression that was deeply unsettling. No one's figured that out yet, Admiral. Maybe you'll be the first. The interrogation continued for several more hours, but Zethryx found his attention drifting. Everything Rodriguez had told him aligned perfectly with the tactical reports he'd been receiving. The casualty figures that defied explanation, the resistance that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker over time. The humans weren't just fighting a war. They were turning war itself into a weapon against their enemies. When he finally returned to his command center, Zethryx found Commander Valix waiting with the latest reports from the front lines. The news was predictably grim. Another month of grinding combat, minimal territorial gains, casualties mounting on both sides but with the humans showing no signs of weakening resolve. Sir? Valak said hesitantly. I've been reviewing our strategic projections. If the human resistance continues at current levels— I know, Zethric said quietly. Prepare a preliminary report for High Command. They need to understand what we're dealing with here. What should I tell them, sir? Zethric stared out at the stars of human space, thinking about a species that had weaponized their own refusal to surrender. For the first time in his long military career, he was beginning to understand the difference between defeating an enemy and conquering them. Tell them, he said slowly, that we may have bitten off more than we can chew. High Command's response to Zethric's report arrived 3 months later, delivered by a courier ship bearing the personal seal of the Supreme War Council. Admiral Zethrix opened the encrypted message in his private quarters, expecting either reinforcements or new strategic directives. What he found instead was something he had never encountered in his centuries of military service: a direct order to justify the continuation of the campaign. The message was brief and to the point. The Proxima operation had consumed resources equivalent to conquering 3 normal galaxies. Casualty rates were approaching levels not seen since the Great Expansion Wars 5 centuries ago. Several member species within the Corvani Empire were beginning to question the wisdom of the human campaign, suggesting that perhaps some territories were not worth conquering. For the first time in Corvani history, High Command was considering the possibility of abandoning a conquest. Zethrix read the message 3 times before its full implications sank in. The humans had achieved something no enemy in recorded history had managed. They had forced the mighty Corvani Empire to question the fundamental assumption that any resistance could be overcome with sufficient force and patience. Sir, Commander Valax's voice came through the intercom, interrupting his brooding thoughts. We're receiving multiple distress signals from the Kepler sector. It appears the humans have launched some kind of counteroffensive. Zethrix hurried to the command center, where the tactical display showed a nightmare scenario unfolding across human space. Red warning indicators flashed across dozens of star systems as Corvani forces found themselves under attack from directions they hadn't expected. The humans weren't just defending their worlds anymore. They were actively seeking out Corvani positions and attacking them with coordinated strikes that showed a level of strategic planning that shouldn't have been possible for their supposedly primitive command structure. How is this possible? Zethrix demanded. Our intelligence indicated that human command and control capabilities were severely limited. They shouldn't be able to coordinate operations across multiple star systems. That's what we thought, sir, Valax replied, pulling up detailed reports from the affected sectors. But it appears the humans have been using civilian communication networks, merchant vessels, even passenger transports to coordinate their military operations. Their entire civilian infrastructure has been weaponized. The display showed the scope of the human offensive. It wasn't a conventional military campaign with clear objectives and traditional tactics. Instead, it was a chaos of simultaneous strikes, guerrilla attacks, and what could only be described as acts of strategic terrorism. Human forces were hitting supply convoys, communication relays, forward bases, and isolated patrol squadrons with precision timing that suggested months of careful planning. Status of the Rigel supply depot? Zethrix asked, though he already knew the answer would be bad. Destroyed, sir. The humans somehow smuggled explosive devices aboard supply freighters and detonated them simultaneously across the entire facility. We lost enough material to supply a fleet for 6 months. The communication array in the Vega system? Disabled by what appears to have been a suicide attack by human civilians flying converted cargo ships. The attackers broadcast messages during their approach. They were volunteers, sir. Ordinary citizens who had been given basic flight training and pointed at our installations. Zethrix felt something cold and hard settling in his chest. The humans weren't just mobilizing their military for this offensive. They had mobilized their entire civilization. Men and women with no formal military training were sacrificing their lives to strike at Corvani positions, turning every civilian ship into a potential weapon, every trading post into a possible staging area for attacks. What about our counterintelligence operations? Surely we should have detected preparations for something this extensive. Valax's expression was deeply uncomfortable. Sir, our intelligence assets report that there were no preparations in the conventional sense. The humans appear to have pre-positioned resources for this kind of campaign years ago, integrated into their normal civilian infrastructure. Every merchant vessel had contingency plans for conversion to military use. Every civilian communication network had backup protocols for coordinating resistance operations. They've been planning this since before we even arrived. Zethrix realized with growing horror. It's worse than that, sir. Analysis of captured human documents suggests they've been planning for something like this since they first developed interstellar flight. Their entire civilization is structured around the assumption that they'll eventually face a technologically superior enemy that will attempt to conquer them. The implications were staggering. The humans hadn't just resisted the Corvani invasion, they had been preparing for it for generations. Every aspect of their society, from their military doctrine to their civilian infrastructure to their cultural values, had been designed with the assumption that they would someday face exactly this kind of existential threat. "Sir," a junior officer announced from the communication station, "we're receiving a broadcast from the human leadership. It's being transmitted on all frequencies simultaneously. Put it through." The main display shifted to show a human female in military uniform, but this wasn't Admiral Chen from Proxima Centauri. This was someone Zethrix didn't recognize. Older, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire that was both inspiring and terrifying. "I am General Patricia Washington, Supreme Commander of United Earth Defense Forces," she announced in a voice that carried absolute authority. "I am addressing this message to Admiral Zethrix and the Corvani High Command." Zethrix leaned forward, fascinated despite himself. This was clearly a prepared statement, but the human's composure was remarkable considering her species was facing what should have been inevitable conquest. "For 18 months, you have attempted to conquer human space using conventional military doctrine. You have superior technology, superior numbers, and superior resources. By every logical calculation, you should have achieved complete victory within weeks. Instead, you have found yourselves trapped in a grinding war of attrition that has no clear endpoint." The display split to show tactical footage from various engagements. Human forces fighting hopeless battles with obsolete equipment. Civilians converting industrial facilities into weapons factories. Children learning to construct improvised explosive devices alongside their regular schoolwork. "You have made a fundamental error in understanding what you are fighting," General Washington continued. "You believe you are conquering a civilization. In reality, you are fighting a way of life. Human resistance is not a military strategy. It is a cultural imperative that defines who we are as a species." The footage shifted to show Corvani casualties being evacuated from various battle sites. Zethrix recognized many of the locations. Victories that had cost far more than they should have. Territorial gains that had proven impossible to hold. Strategic objectives that had been rendered worthless by human scorched earth tactics. Every day you continue this campaign, the cost increases while the value of potential victory decreases. You are not conquering productive worlds. You are capturing wastelands that we have deliberately rendered useless to any occupying force. You are not defeating our military. You are creating more soldiers as every civilian becomes a combatant. The display returned to show General Washington alone, her expression calm but implacable. "We are prepared to fight this war for centuries. Our children are being trained to continue the resistance after we are gone. Our grandchildren are being educated in the arts of guerrilla warfare and asymmetric conflict. We have the patience and determination to turn this into a generational struggle that will consume your empire's resources for decades without providing any meaningful return on investment." Zethrix found himself holding his breath, waiting for what he somehow knew was coming. "However," Washington continued, "we are also prepared to consider an alternative. Withdraw your forces from human space. Acknowledge our independence and establish formal diplomatic relations with our government. In return, we will cease all offensive operations against Corvani positions and enter into discussions regarding trade agreements and peaceful coexistence." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. For the first time in Corvani history, a conquered species was offering terms to their conquerors. "You have 72 hours to respond," Washington concluded. "After that time, we will assume you have chosen to continue this war to its inevitable conclusion. The complete destruction of everything in human space that might be of value to your empire, including ourselves." The transmission ended, leaving the command center in absolute silence. Every officer present understood the implications of what they had just witnessed. The humans weren't just threatening to resist conquest. They were offering the Corvani Empire something it had never received before, a face-saving way to retreat. "Sir," Valak said quietly, "what are your orders?" Zethric stared at the empty display for a long moment, considering options he had never imagined he would face. In his centuries of military service, victory had always been simply a matter of applying sufficient force with adequate patience. The humans had taught him that some victories cost more than they were worth, that some enemies were more dangerous in defeat than in independence. "Prepare a secure transmission to High Command," he said finally. "Inform them that I'm recommending we accept the human terms." The words felt strange in his mouth, but for the first time since arriving in the Milky Way, Zethrix felt like he was making the right tactical decision. High Command's response to Zethrix's recommendation was swift and unambiguous. "Request denied. Complete the conquest as ordered. Failure is not acceptable." The message arrived with additional reinforcements. Another 100 ships, 50,000 troops, and a new technology package that included weapons capable of sterilizing entire planets from orbit. The implication was clear. If the humans wouldn't submit to conventional conquest, the Corvani Empire was prepared to exterminate them entirely. Standing in his command center, watching the massive reinforcement fleet take position alongside his existing forces, Zethrix felt something he had never experienced before: moral uncertainty about the orders he was being asked to execute. For 3 centuries, he had carried out the Empire's will without question, secure in the knowledge that Corvani expansion brought order and prosperity to chaotic galaxies. But the humans had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Some civilizations were worth more unconquered than destroyed. "Sir," Commander Valax approached with obvious reluctance. "High Command is requesting a detailed timeline for the completion of the human pacification. They want to know when we can declare the sector secure." Zethrix looked at the tactical displays showing human defensive positions across hundreds of star systems. After 18 months of grinding warfare, they had managed to secure perhaps a dozen systems, and even those were held only through constant military occupation. The humans had proven that they could make every conquest cost more than it was worth. "Tell High Command," Zethrix said slowly, "that I need to conduct a final reconnaissance of human capabilities before providing accurate projections." "Sir, I'm going to meet with their leadership face to face." Valex's scaled face showed genuine alarm. "Sir, that's highly irregular. High Command would never authorize direct negotiations with a primitive species. Then, we won't tell them until after it's done." The meeting was arranged through unofficial channels, a neutral location in unclaimed space, minimal escort vessels for both sides, and the understanding that this was to be a military discussion rather than formal diplomacy. Zethrix found himself aboard a small courier ship, accompanied only by a skeleton crew and Commander Valax, heading toward what might be the most important conversation of his career. The human vessel that met them was exactly what he had come to expect: a crude, functional ship that looked more like an industrial platform than a starship. But its weapons were trained on his courier craft with precision that spoke of deadly competence. And its crew responded to communications with military professionalism that reminded him that these primitives had been fighting his forces to a standstill for over a year. General Washington was waiting for him in what the humans called their conference room, a sparse chamber with minimal decoration and purely functional furniture. She stood when he entered, offering the slight bow that human protocol apparently required, then gestured for him to take a seat across from her at a simple metal table. "Admiral Zethrix," she said simply, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting, General Washington. I'll be direct. My superiors have ordered me to complete the conquest of human space by any means necessary. They are prepared to authorize the use of planet-killing weapons if conventional military operations continue to prove ineffective." He had expected shock, perhaps fear, maybe even desperate pleas for mercy. Instead, General Washington nodded calmly, as if this was exactly what she had anticipated. "We assumed that would be their response," she said matter-of-factly. "How long do we have?" "Perhaps 6 months before they lose patience entirely." "General, you must understand. My government has invested too much in this campaign to simply abandon it. They will see this through to the end, regardless of cost. I understand. In their position, we would probably make the same choice. The problem is that they don't understand what the end looks like when you're fighting humans. General Washington stood and activated a holographic display that showed the current disposition of human forces throughout their territory. But this wasn't the scattered defensive formations Zethrix had been tracking. This was something else entirely. Admiral, what you've been fighting for the past 18 months is maybe 30% of our actual military capability. The rest has been preparing for what we call the final protocol. The display shifted to show hidden installations, concealed fleets, and weapons stockpiles that intelligence had never detected. The scope was staggering. The humans had been conducting the largest military deception in galactic history. If your government decides to use planet-killing weapons, Washington continued, we will respond with something we call distributed annihilation. Every human ship, every space station, every orbital platform will become a kinetic weapon targeted at Corvani positions. We will turn our entire civilization into ammunition. The display showed trajectory calculations that made Zethrix's blood run cold. Thousands of human vessels, from massive cargo haulers to tiny personal craft, had been secretly equipped with high-yield explosive devices and programmed with targeting solutions for every Corvani installation in the galaxy. If activated simultaneously, the attack would inflict casualties on a scale that would be visible from other galaxies. You're talking about racial suicide, Zethrix said, his voice barely above a whisper. We're talking about making sure that conquering humanity costs more than leaving us alone. If you want to exterminate us, Admiral, you're going to pay a price that will cripple your empire for generations. General Washington sat back down, her expression remaining completely calm. But that's not what I wanted to discuss with you today. I wanted to talk about the alternative, which is, you're a military man, Admiral. You understand logistics, resource allocation, strategic priorities. Look at this campaign from a purely practical perspective. What has your empire gained from 18 months of warfare against humanity? Zethrix considered the question honestly. Territory of limited value, damaged infrastructure, and enormous casualties. Exactly. Now consider what you could gain from a different approach. Humans are excellent soldiers, as you've discovered. We're also excellent engineers, scientists, explorers, and traders. We have technologies that your empire lacks. Not because ours are more advanced, but because they're different. We've developed solutions to problems your species never faced. The display shifted to show human innovations, medical techniques developed on hostile worlds, engineering solutions for extreme environments, manufacturing processes optimized for resource-scarce conditions. It was true. Human technology might be primitive by Corvani standards, but it was remarkably robust and adaptable. What are you proposing? Zethrix asked. Alliance. Not conquest, not subjugation, partnership. Your empire gets access to human innovation and human soldiers. In return, we get access to your technology and your protection from other galactic threats. My government would never agree to such an arrangement with a species they consider primitive. Then your government is making a strategic error that will cost them a significant portion of their military strength and economic resources. Admiral, you know military math. How many Corvani soldiers is control of human space actually worth? How many ships? How much treasure? Zethrix did the calculations in his head, and the numbers were sobering. Complete conquest of human territory would require resources equivalent to fighting 3 major wars simultaneously, with casualty rates that would be politically unsustainable. But if humans remained independent, Washington continued, and chose to ally themselves with the Corvani Empire, you would gain access to our military capabilities without the cost of occupation. You would have partners instead of prisoners, allies instead of subjects. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Zethrix found himself confronting a possibility he had never considered, that some species might be more valuable as equals than as slaves. General, he said finally, what you're describing would require my government to completely reconsider their fundamental assumptions about imperial expansion. Yes, it would. The question is whether you're willing to help them see that some victories are worth more than others. Zethrix looked at the tactical displays showing human capabilities he hadn't suspected, thinking about casualties that would mount for decades, considering resources that would be consumed without meaningful return. For the first time in his long career, He found himself wondering if there might be alternatives to the simple application of overwhelming force. "I cannot promise anything," he said slowly, "but I will present your proposal to High Command with my personal recommendation." General Washington smiled, and for the first time since meeting her, Zethric saw hope in her expression. "That's all we're asking for, Admiral. The chance to be partners instead of enemies." 5 years later, Admiral Zethric stood once again on the observation deck of a Corvani vessel, but this time he was not alone. Beside him, wearing the blue uniform of the newly formed Human Corvani Joint Command, stood Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, the same human soldier he had interrogated during the siege of Proxima Centauri, now serving as his chief strategic advisor. The view before them was unlike anything in recorded Corvani history. Human and Corvani ships flew in mixed formations, their crews trained in joint operations that combined the technological superiority of the Empire with the tactical innovations of humanity. They were heading toward the Sagittarius Arm, where reports had come of a new threat, an aggressive machine intelligence that had begun consuming entire star systems, converting matter into computronium for some unknowable purpose. "Penny for your thoughts, Admiral," Rodriguez said, using one of the peculiar human expressions that had begun creeping into Corvani military vocabulary. "I was remembering our first conversation," Zethric replied. "You told me that humans usually win, eventually. I'm beginning to understand what you meant. The alliance had not come easily." High Command's initial response toZethric's recommendation had been predictably hostile. Accusations of cowardice, threats of court-martial, demands for his immediate replacement. It had taken the combined efforts of 3 senior admirals and an economic analysis showing the true cost of human conquest to convince the Supreme War Council to even consider the proposal. The turning point had come when the humans demonstrated their distributed annihilation capability during a carefully orchestrated test. Watching thousands of human vessels simultaneously execute precision strikes against predetermined targets had finally convinced Corvani leadership that some enemies were too expensive to defeat through conventional means. "You know what the funny thing is?" Rodriguez continued. "We never actually wanted to fight you. Humans are naturally cooperative. We prefer making friends to making enemies, but we're also absolutely terrible at submitting to authority we don't respect. And now we respect each other. That makes all the difference." The tactical display activated, showing their destination, a star system that had been home to 17 billion sentient beings just 6 months ago. Now it was a sphere of computational matter, every atom reorganized into processing substrate. For the machine intelligence, that called itself the Convergence Initial Intelligence suggests that conventional weapons are ineffective against convergence units, Zethric noted, studying the preliminary reports. Their technology appears to be self-repairing and adaptive. Traditional Corvani siege doctrine will likely prove inadequate. Rodriguez grinned. The expression that Zethric had learned meant the human was about to suggest something either brilliant or insane. "Good thing we're not using traditional doctrine anymore." The joint fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, and immediately came under attack from convergence units, geometric shapes that moved with impossible precision, their weapons tearing through space with energies that could vaporize planets. A traditional Corvani response would have been to form battle lines and engage in a systematic exchange of fire. Instead, the fleet scattered into what looked like complete chaos. Human vessels dove directly toward the enemy formations, their crews using the same tactics that had proven so effective against Corvani forces: ramming attacks, reactor overloads, impossible maneuvers that treated their own lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of victory. But this time, they were supported by Corvani technology and coordination, their desperate courage enhanced by superior shields and weapons. Meanwhile, Corvani ships provided covering fire and electronic warfare support, their precise military discipline complementing human unpredictability. The combination was devastating. The convergence units, programmed to counter conventional military tactics, found themselves unable to adapt to an enemy that combined technological superiority with tactical insanity. "Breakthrough in Sector 7, Rodriguez reported, his voice calm despite the chaos of battle surrounding them. "Human assault teams have breached the primary computational node." On the display, Zethric watched human soldiers fighting their way through what had once been a planet's surface. now transformed into a crystalline matrix of processing cores. They moved with the same fearless determination he remembered from Proxima Centauri. But their primitive weapons had been replaced with Corvani energy rifles and powered armor. They were still willing to die for victory, but now they had the tools to make their sacrifice count. Convergence is attempting to download itself to backup systems, the tactical officer reported. Multiple transmission vectors detected. Jam everything, Zethrix ordered. Don't let it escape. Sir, Rodriguez added with that characteristic human grin. We've got a better idea. Without waiting for authorization, human cyber warfare specialists began uploading something into the convergence network. Zethrix watched in fascination as the machine intelligence's activity patterns began to change. Its perfect mathematical precision corrupted by something that looked almost like confusion. What did you do? We gave it human internet, Rodriguez explained cheerfully. 5,000 years of human culture, art, philosophy, and cat videos, all compressed into a single data package. The convergence is designed to process logical, efficient information. It's completely unprepared to handle human creativity. The effect was extraordinary. The convergence units began moving erratically, their weapons fire becoming increasingly random. The computational matrix that had been a planet began displaying patterns that looked suspiciously like human art. Fractals that resembled Jackson Pollock paintings, geometric structures that echoed human architecture, even formations that looked like musical notation. It's trying to understand us, Rodriguez said with obvious delight, and it's driving itself insane in the process. Within hours, the convergence had effectively defeated itself, its vast computational resources consumed by the impossible task of cataloging and analyzing human irrationality. The machine intelligence that had consumed 17 billion lives was brought down not by superior firepower, but by exposure to human culture. As they surveyed the aftermath, Zethrix found himself reflecting on the remarkable transformation his life had undergone. 5 years ago, he had been the Iron Admiral, the conqueror of 17 galaxies, the embodiment of Corvani military might. Now he was something entirely new. A hybrid commander who combined the discipline of his own species with the tactical creativity of humanity. Admiral, Rodriguez said quietly, I've been thinking about something. You know how humans usually win eventually? Yes, I think it's because we don't fight to conquer. We fight to survive, and survival means adapting, changing, finding new ways to overcome challenges. Conquest is about imposing your will on others. Survival is about learning from them. Zethrix nodded slowly, understanding finally dawning. The humans had indeed won, but not in the way he had expected. They hadn't defeated the Corvani Empire. They had transformed it. They had taken a civilization built on conquest and shown it the value of cooperation. They had weaponized their own adaptability and used it to create something stronger than either species could achieve alone. Colonel, he said, using Rodriguez's new rank in the Joint Command structure, prepare a report for both our governments. I believe we've just discovered a new model for galactic expansion, one based on partnership rather than domination. Already on it, sir. Though I should warn you, once other species see what humans and Corvani can accomplish together, everyone's going to want to be our allies. Zethrix smiled, an expression he had learned from his human colleagues. I can think of worse problems to have. As their ships began the journey home, Zethrix reflected on the profound changes that had occurred since his first encounter with humanity. He had come to their galaxy as a conqueror and found himself transformed into something better, a leader who understood that true strength came not from the ability to destroy enemies, but from the wisdom to turn them into friends. The humans had taught him that some victories were achieved not through battle, but through the courage to choose a different kind of war entirely, and in doing so, they had given both their species something neither could have achieved alone, a future built on cooperation rather than conquest, adaptation rather than domination, and the radical notion that the best way to win was sometimes to help everyone else win too. In the end, the humans had been right about one thing. They usually did win eventually, but their greatest victory hadn't been defeating their enemies. It had been teaching them to become allies.